In 2019, after I'd been hang gliding for over 10 years, I made some mistakes landing and broke my arm. It was my first flight on a trip to Monroe, Utah, and after that, I didn't fly there for years. This is my story of returning to Monroe. And it wasn't going back there just to fly for fun, which would have been hard enough, but in my second ever hang gliding competition. Now, I really had no plans to go back to Monroe after what happened. But the first Red Rocks hang gliding competition was taking place in June 2023, and the organizers asked if I would run the event's social media. I agreed to do that, but of course, I wanted to fly too. If you've seen any of my videos, you probably know I specialize in low altitude dune soaring. At the beginning of last year, when all this was happening, I had zero cross-country experience, so no competitions either. I also had a lot of fear around landing because of breaking my arm, and I was especially worried about flying at Monroe. I tried to start preparing for the Monroe competition by doing a lot of landing practice and some flight simulator training. I also went to another competition in February, the El Peñón Hang Gliding Classic in Valle de Bravo in Mexico. That was my first competition, and I figured if I could do that one, which has high altitudes and turbulent air like in Utah, then that would be the best preparation I could get for Monroe. I was glad I started with Valle. I did have some interesting landings, like jumping a fence on my first ever XC flight. I landed safely. My other landings weren't all perfect, but they were safe and gave me more confidence for Monroe. And I'll just mention, I was also excited to make my first goal of 36 kilometers on the third task, which was my third cross-country flight ever, and barely made it onto the women's podium. I kept telling myself if I could do Valle, I could do Monroe, but even the week of the Red Rocks competition, I still didn't feel ready. Also, I should explain, if it sounds like I should just have been over it by then, well, it would be nice if fear worked that way, but more importantly, if I broke my arm again, it would be a lot worse. That's not fear, that's just a medical fact. That's always in my mind because of the plate in my arm. Anyway, it was finally time for Monroe, and I was hoping to ease back into flying there with an evening flight and hopefully an easy landing in the field where I'd crashed back in 2019. But the weather wasn't working out and high winds kept us from launching, and they continued over the next few days, keeping us from flying the comp as well. I felt badly for everyone else there, but for me, honestly, I mainly felt relieved. And it gave me the chance to revisit the place where I crashed and really think about how I felt for the week. I haven't talked about this super much, but I actually broke my arm right here in this field back in 2019. It was my first launch from Monroe during the 2019 Red Rocks fly-in, and my feet came out from under me and I hit a bush, swung through. So that's why I've been so focused on my landings, especially the past few years, and why I've been really nervous about coming back flying here. After a few windy days of hiking, but mostly waiting and anticipation, even I was finally feeling ready to fly. On Wednesday, which was halfway through the scheduled days, we finally had our first task of 92 kilometers to an airport. I was back to being pretty nervous. Then, when I took off, my harness lines got caught on my oxygen tank, which I was wearing under my ski suit since I didn't yet have a comp harness. I fixed it and was able to climb back above launch, but that messed with my mindset a bit and made me anxious again. I really questioned going cross-country and almost just flew straight to the normal landing area. But I knew I'd be disappointed in myself if I didn't at least try, so I went on course. I only made it 17 kilometers, but the most important thing was trying it all, then landing safely for my first flight back in Monroe. And I did. Getting that landing made me feel a lot better, but I still hadn't actually landed in the LZ where I'd broken my arm. The next few days were again too windy to compete, and seeing skilled pilots have challenging landings only made me more nervous. I finally got my last chance of the week to try again when it became flyable for the second and final task, which had us flying 61 kilometers directly over Monroe Peak before landing in the main LZ. This time, I definitely felt more ready to give it my best shot. I had a tough time heading upwind across the canyon to reach Monroe Peak, but I was excited to fly over it for the first time since 2019. 3.5 hours later, because I'm still pretty slow, I was on final glide to goal, and the LZ that I thought about way too many times over the past few years. All I had left to do was land. I had a nearly perfect touchdown in the place I was most afraid to land. It was my longest, highest, and farthest flight ever, and my 10th ever cross-country flight. It also took me from nearly last place in the comp to squeaking into the top 10 in sport class.
In 10th place, Erica Klein.
But really, the main thing I cared about was that safe landing at Monroe, and it was so validating to get that. Even after these experiences, I do still get worried about landing. But I'm glad I didn't let fear hold me back from returning to Monroe. It's been almost a year now, and I've thought a lot about that experience and the effect of injuries, which I think many pilots don't talk about enough. I'm doing my best to use my fear to help keep me safe, but without letting it control my actions. I'm also learning better to focus on the positives because I know I love flying, even if it can be scary sometimes. We all know that flying a hang glider, paraglider, or anything else is risky, but for me, it's worth it. I'm going for a little less fear and a little more positivity every day.